Um, the lecture today is going to be split roughly half and half between talking about the Grand Duchess and the site in Moscow that she founded in 1908, the Martha Mary Convent. The publicity that Hannah has created for me is very apt here with this half and half image. I'll be introducing Elizaveta and then moving on to the convent itself, including this most striking centerpiece building. This is the Church of the Intercession of the Virgin. I'll mainly focus on two artists, the painter Mikhail Nestorov and the architect Alexei Shusov. And along the way, I'll be bringing in some material reflecting my research interests, which, as Hannah mentioned, cultural links between Britain and Russia and the Art Nouveau and arts and crafts movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I'll also highlight some examples of works in the museum's collection, and these were what inspired my choice of topic. So let's begin with Elizaveta. If I can work backwards from the present day, I think there are several reasons why she receives lots of attention. Firstly, she was a member of the ill-fated Romanov family, the last czars of the Russian Empire, and she was murdered brutally along with them in 1918. But not only that, she was widowed herself when her husband was assassinated. We'll come back to that shortly. Secondly, she was a very beautiful young woman. As you can see from the photographs here, which are in the royal collection. And by the way, there are hundreds of photos of Elizaveta in the British Royal Collection, if you're interested. The fact that she was so beautiful and then when she was widowed decided to become a nun obviously attracts some attention. And I think the combination of good deeds, beauty and an untimely death makes me wonder if we can draw some parallels with Princess Diana, for example. And there's often this association between royal women and needing to be seen to do good. It's something that carries on to this day, as we know. But the slightly different thing about Elizaveta is that she's been canonized. She is now a saint. And this has added to the mythology around her. She's now called Grand Duchess Saint Elizabeth, new martyr of Russia. And it's not only on account of her work at the convent, but her murder along with the other Romanovs has given her the status of a martyr. And as she's a saint, as you see here, you can buy icons of Elizaveta, and there are lots of variants on that. You can even buy yourself a necklace from Etsy if you so wish. That's my image at the bottom of the slide. For Orthodox Christians, icons are visual images, are the way to practice the religion rather than the written word, as in the Western Christian church. Sainthood and martyrdom, that's another topic altogether, which I won't really dwell on today, but I do want to mention one of the museum's objects straight away, and that's that they've got this apostolnik, this headdress, wimple, and this, of course, can be considered a relic since it's associated with a saint. But Elizaveta wasn't actually Russian and she wasn't Orthodox at first. She was born a Lutheran, and she was, her birth name was Prince Elizabeth of Hessen by Rhine, and she married into the Russian royal family, as did her younger sister, Princess Alex, who is the little girl here on the right. As you can see in this rather stiff family portrait, they're all not looking particularly happy. Elizaveta is the one standing at the back behind the desk. She was known to her family as Ella, and you will often hear her referred to as Ella of Hesse. Her mother was Princess Alice, who was one of the daughters of Queen Victoria. And so Queen Victoria was her grandmother, and this meant that she was always linked with this huge dynasty, these connections between the royal families of Europe. As you know, there was lots of intermarriage between the monarchy in this time. And this painting here on the right-hand side, again, another painting from the royal collection, shows the huge family of Queen Victoria. So as I mentioned, Ella and Alex both married into the Romanov dynasty. Yelizaveta, Ella, she married Grand Duke Sergei, and he was the son of Alexander II and the brother of Alexander III, the uncle to Nicholas II. And Alex became the empress. So she married Nicholas II. So both sisters very right at the center of the family of the last Tsars. Both of the sisters converted to Orthodoxy after their marriage, and they took Russian names. So Ella became Yelizaveta Feodorovna, and Alex became Alexandra Feodorovna. And they both embraced their roles as Russian royals, and they engaged in the imperial project, which at this time had turned towards nationalism and the historical, the resurrection of historical traditions, and really this kind of repetition of the imperial ideology of the Romanov dynasty. It was one of the ways that they tried to maintain their strength and their sense of power. And so here we see the two sisters engaged in perhaps the most much discussed event of imperial opulence. And this was the costume ball that was held in 1903, where everybody dressed up in 17th and 16th century costumes. All the crown jewels were on display, and as you can see, the costumes were really quite something. I mean, just have a look at those headdresses and boots, for example, the boots that Sergei is wearing on the right there. But of course, at the same time, the two women were, they remained Europeans as well. And having an English mother meant that they had a special connection with Britain. And this was enhanced especially when, unfortunately, Princess Alice died of diphtheria, aged only 35. And the two girls were brought up in the family of Queen Victoria. They had an English governess. They lived at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. And again, there's lots of information about these British Russian royal ties at the time. But for all the privileges of being Romanovs and marrying into Russian royalty at a time of growing dissent, this proved tragic for Yelizaveta, as her husband, Grand Duke Sergei, was assassinated during the Russian Revolution of 1905. And like his father, he was killed by a terrorist bomb, a bomb in the street at close quarters. And Yelizaveta followed the kind of customary practice. She wore black. She honored her husband's memory. But it's reported that she visited the bomber in prison and she forgave him. And so this was a kind of an early indication of her religion, her sense of charity and kind-heartedness, let's call it that. And she continued to promote the legacy of Sergei, despite the fact that he had a reputation as something of an authoritarian in his public roles. She arranged for a monument for Sergei's grave, and this is the, sorry, not the grave, she arranged for a memorial, and this is what you see on the right-hand side. And even later, when she founded the convent, the nuns at the convent had to make an annual pilgrimage to the memorial church where Sergei's remains were on the anniversary of his death. I can briefly bring in a little bit of art here, as this monument reveals Yelizaveta's contacts with the contemporary artists working in the National Revival style. Both she and her husband had been involved in artistic patronage, including overseeing some of the Russian displays at international art exhibitions, a lot of which focused on national traditions, folk art, arts and crafts, and so on. And they were also involved in various church building projects, again, in a national revival style. So she was aware of recent developments to look for new kinds of art, which were looking back to these past medieval traditions and folk art, for example. And this cross was designed by Viktor Vasnetsov, and he's one of the primary figures in Russia's arts and crafts and national revival movements. We'll come back to those a little later. I want to mention now that as a member of the court and the elite, Yelizaveta enjoyed a very privileged lifestyle, of course. This was a period when luxury was celebrated, gifts of Fabergé were exchanged between members of the monarchy, as those of you who are like me in Britain and may have seen the Fabergé exhibition that's on in London at the moment. Expensive jewelry was abundant. So I've got a couple of examples here just to show you. This is a frame in the British Royal Collection, a Fabergé frame, beautiful enamel there. And on the right hand side, we see the Grand Duchess in her wedding gift jewelry here. So these beautiful cabochon emeralds that you see on the tiara there, and this amazing necklace, and this is all part of her wedding gifts. And she chose to give all of this up. She gave up all her worldly possessions. She sold everything in order to found the convent and pay for the construction of the site. So here we have Yelizaveta as a nun. When she chose to take the vow and found the sisterhood, she had very precise aims for it. So she wasn't planning to step away from life. She still wanted the convent to be to take an active part in society. And she wrote down her vision and her intentions. And this, interestingly, was all put together in an album about the life and history of the convent. And it's something that the History Museum has a copy of. And it's really this, actually. And then another item, which we'll come to a bit later, it was this that made me think this links, this is something I'd like to speak about. And what the album explains is that she talks in the album about the various parts of the convent. So she talks about the fact that there was a hospital for the sick and the war wounded. There was a school for orphans. There was a library. And there were the living quarters for the nuns, and the nuns were required to do all the usual things, sort of get up very early to go to prayer. They were required to go out into Moscow and visit the homes of people who were sick. So there was this kind of very active, engaged, charitable, very active charitable work. Another feature, that was just to show you a couple of images which illustrate the sisters. If you can see in the bottom right, you've got the abbess sitting in the middle of a group of nuns in nurses uniform. And that top left is also a picture of Yelizaveta. Another feature of convent life that I wanted to mention was sewing and embroidery. And this really reflected not only a craft that was long associated with the convent, but also a tradition that was something quite widespread among the Russian people. So it was associated with royalty as well. It was associated with the wider public. As I'm sure you're aware, at the end of the 19th century, the vast majority of the population of Russia were the peasantry, and they were living on the land. And so there was a very huge focus on folk arts and crafts traditions. And so for women, this often involved embroidery. So what I'm showing you here in these images is the image on the left is the sort of peasant woman embroidering, and through that window you can see the church, which sort of links in this idea of embroidery being a kind of spiritual activity too. And then on the right hand side, an image of a woman who's embroidering in gold thread. And there is a long tradition in Russian church history of icons being embroidered as well, and often in convents. So this was a tradition which Yelizaveta was kind of perpetuating right into the 20th century. And I mentioned that she was interested in embroidery, but she supported it as well as embroidering herself. The piece on the right, again, something from the museum's collection, is an embroidery which Yelizaveta is thought to have embroidered herself. We see her on the left-hand side embroidering too. And I mentioned international exhibitions that she and Sergei supported, and she was patron of several displays of Russian women's work, which again included work from local needlework schools, local councils, convent workshops, and so on. And sometimes this could be replicas of, again, medieval work or 16th and 17th century work. And for example, I show here on the left a reproduction that was shown at the Chicago International Exposition in 1893. And this was, as I say, so part of when Russian art was presented to the West, they were presenting this revival movement too. So now let's turn to the convent buildings. I haven't mentioned it yet, but I have been to this convent and walked around, and I can testify to how beautiful a place it is. Here's my photo of the entrance gate. This was taken in the late afternoon on a September day in around 7 years ago. But I'd like to quote a visitor, a much earlier visitor who went to the convent around 1917. And that was the American journalist, Retta Child Dorr. And she wrote a book called Inside the Russian Revolution, which some of you may know, published in 1918. And she enthusiastically shares her visit and says that her visit took place on the very day that Nicholas II and his family were taken away from Moscow to exile in Siberia, but that Yelizaveta, the Grand Duchess, was still at this time living in the convent. So Retta Child Dorr describes the convent as follows. She says it's a group of white stone and stucco houses built around an old garden and surrounded by a high white wall over which vines and foliage ramble and fall. A key turned, the brown gate swung open, and we stepped into a garden running over with the richest bloom. I remember the pink and white sweet peas against the wall, the white Madonna lilies that nodded below, and the carpet of gay verbenas that ran along the pathway to the convent door. There were many old apple trees and a forest of lilacs, purple and white. The gentle scene that she creates sounds rather similar to an old postcard from 1917, this is the second object that made me want to speak about the convent. And it shows this flourishing garden with lilies in the foreground and one of the sisters reading to a child, perhaps an orphan. And I get the sense when I look at this that the garden is flourishing a lot more than it was when I visited it, and it had obviously changed a lot over the 100 years. And this writer goes on to describe the garden as a kind of hive of activity. She says the nuns are at work among the potato rows. Some are pruning trees and hedges. Some are sweeping the gravel paths with brooms made of twigs. Some are teaching orphan girls to embroider at big frames and to knit and sew. So now let's turn our attention. Hold on, I think I've skipped a slide. No, maybe not. Let's turn our attention to the art and architecture of the convent. I wanted to focus this mainly on two men, Shusov, Alexei Shusov, who I've mentioned, and Mikhail Nestorov. And these two were friends. They're standing in, you can see this picture top left where the two men are standing together. Nestorov, I'm thinking that's the one on the right, and Shusov on the left, though I admit I'm not totally sure. And they were 11 years apart in age. The choice of Shusov was suggested to the Grand Duchess by Nestorov. And what's quite interesting about these two men was that both had long careers that lasted well after the revolution, actually, but they completely changed their art. Because both working in this kind of religious style beforehand, and the Soviets banned religion, so they had to change. Shusov, in fact, I should mention, he was Moldovan, and Moldova at this time was part of the Russian Empire. He was born in Chisinau. And he had his breakthrough when he worked on the Lavra, the monastery in Kiev, which I show bottom left. He worked on the reworking of the iconostasis, which is the icon screen in the monastery. And after this, he went on to get bigger public commissions. So one of his commissions was this cathedral, this memorial cathedral at the site of the Battle of Kulikovo. But he's most famous for his designs for Moscow. So, for example, the Kazan station, the Kazan railway station, which is still there today, as you see bottom left. And you see it's a completely different kind of style to the convent. The most famous thing he designed was Lenin's tomb. I show this top left. I show it in its original wooden form. It was later replaced with this red and black granite structure that we all know so well. And what about Nestorov? Well, Nestorov, before the revolution, was mainly known for religious symbolist paintings, the most famed example of which is this image top left. This is called The Vision of the Youth Bartholomew, and it's about the life of Saint Sergius, one of Russia's important saints. And the boy is the young Sergius, who a vision appears to him in the forest. And this sort of painting reflects the kind of artistic mood at the time. It was Art Nouveau. It was about, it was moving away from realist painting, which had been the previous art movement that was reflecting real life, and it was moving towards mythical themes. Nestorov's painting is a little bit of a mix, though, because the background here, this very kind of spiritualized and beautiful, tranquil Russian landscape, was in fact based on a real life scene, which was at the artist colony at Abramtsevo. Abramtsevo was really the start of arts, the sort of arts and crafts Art Nouveau movement in Russia. And I show you on the right the little church, which was the heart of this estate. Abramtsevo was an artist colony. It was a country estate, and it was run by a couple called Sava Marmontov and Elizaveta Marmontova, and they both together, they encouraged this revival in art that was happening at the time. And this was all called, it was called the Silver Age, this fin de siècle time. Lots of theatre, poetry, a turn to craft as well. So a really very vibrant time in art. And Nestorov, as I say, he had to switch too after the revolution. He became mainly a portrait painter, and he painted famous figures. I show you just too quickly here his portrait of the famous Soviet sculptor Vera Mukina, and then on the left his portrait of Alexei Shusov, which shows that he was still friends with the architect many years later. So what do I mean when I say that this convent church is a church in the revival style? Well, in architecture, the revival of past traditions meant looking back to past prototypes in architecture. And one thing that they were particularly interested in was the white stone churches of the north. So here I show you one of the earliest, a very, very beautiful stone church. And I've found this wonderful image on the internet, which I share with you, with the fantastic reflection in the lake. And this is called the Church of the Intercession on the Nerl, and it's in the Vladimir region. Shusov in particular was interested in churches in the Pskov and Novgorod regions, a couple of which I'm showing you here, a 14th century and a 15th century example. And just take note of some of the details of these churches that you will see replicated in the convent church. You can really easy, isn't it, to see how the inspiration comes from these earlier churches. And before he designed the convent church, Shusov designed other churches. I mean, I've mentioned the Kulikovo, but also here's one at Ternopil in Ukraine, another monastery church, which has a mosaic on the front, a huge mosaic by Nikolai Rerik. And Rerik is, he's the designer of the sets and costumes for the Rite of Spring, okay? So he's a very well-known Russian revival artist working in theatre and all sorts of other things. I want to mention as well the exteriors, because these exteriors, by the way, are from the convent church. These are my photos from when I visited, just a few details to highlight to you some of what's going on with the exterior of the convent. These aren't by Shusov, they're by Nestorov on top right. This is a mosaic of Christ the Savior by Nestorov, and another artist worked on these very ornate stone carvings, and he was Sergei Konyenkov. Again, we can look back to the precedent of old churches where often the facades had these tiny little symbols. This one is a different one, another Vladimir church, but you can see more closely here the type of decoration and ornamentation that was being revived. And I want to draw a quick parallel here with Art Nouveau arts and crafts movements elsewhere, because this is a church which is actually not too far from where I live, and it's the Watts Cemetery Chapel at the gallery Watts Gallery, after Frederick and Mary Watts. And as you can see, she's doing exactly, well, not quite exactly the same, but she's doing a very similar thing in terms of taking all of this symbolism, this ornamental Celtic motifs, Scandinavian, Northern, Eastern, and a real mix of stylistic influences there. So let's now move inside the convent. The murals were painted by Nestorov, and this time working with another artist, yet another one. This just means we can think of this as a Gesamtkunstwerk, as many of the, a total work of art, as many of the projects at the fin de siècle were. They were group collaborative projects. The blue and white walls create a really strong impression when you go inside, very tranquil, very beautiful. And quite different from the type of church interiors that we see in, for example, I don't know if you've been to St. Basil's, or you may have been to the churches in the Kremlin, and they're completely covered in this kind of stylized interior painting. And this is a more pared down style. If you look to the angel on the pillar, the pylon on the right-hand side. I'll show you that in detail, and it gives you a sense of the way that these images are quite modern in the approach that's taken to them. And there's a very beautiful use of this blue, white and gold palette. And this is something which symbolist artists were particularly concerned with, the color blue. The movement a little later would even be called the blue rose movement. So this idea of blue was extremely important. The Martha and Mary, I want to mention that this mural depicts the scene of Martha and Mary. And so although this is a church to the intercession of the Virgin, so you would expect the iconography of the Virgin Mary, you've got here the story of Martha and Mary. And if I show you, so we're moving around a little bit more. If you can think of that mural that you just saw as being sort of on the left at the top, I want to pick out a couple of things in this area around the iconostasis, the icon screen in the middle. So first of all, if you look to the left of Angel Gabriel, you'll see in the corner a couple of icons. And these are the ones which were used in the initial publicity for the talk, and this interesting icon of Martha and Mary on the right-hand side. And you can, I won't try and use the pointer, but if you can see at the top of the images, just to the left, there's some lettering, and that identifies Martha and Mary. And they're also identified as saints by the fact that they have the nimbus around their heads. But you can see there's a kind of, they are icons, but they're painted in a very sort of turn of the century style. And it's noticeable that Nestorov, in his icon, he's giving equal prominence to both Martha and Mary. And those of you who are practicing Christians will probably know the story of Martha and Mary, the sisters of Lazarus, and the idea that they reflect two different ways of serving Christ, so to speak. We would, Martha is regarded as the kind of doer, the active person, who and Mary is the quiet one who was listening to Christ more attentively. And sometimes Martha is regarded more negatively, as though she's not doing the right thing. But I want to show you, just by comparison, this story obviously comes up a lot in art, and I just give you a couple of precedents here, one Western and one from the Russian Empire. On the top left, I've given you an image by Vermeer, and this is in the Scottish National Gallery. And this shows Martha and Mary in Western dress. We can surmise here that Mary is the one sitting on the ground listening, and Martha is the one at the back who's baking bread. But again, Vermeer is not, he's treating them with equal prominence. But if you look at the painting from the Russian Empire, this is by the Polish painter, Henryk Semiradsky. He's got Mary at the front and then Martha in the background looking rather suspicious. So I think that's another, it's really illustrating that there are different ways of telling this story visually. And Semiradsky's style, by the way, this is called Salon Painting, and this is taking the kind of salon style that was also around in Europe at the time. And it's noticeable, though, that not that much later we see Nestorov's versions, which I've put at the bottom of the screen here, and Nestorov's Martha and Mary with Christ and bottom right is almost, the background there is almost Cézannist, isn't it? It's somewhat reminiscent of Cézanne's landscape painting. And Nestorov had been abroad, so we know that he'd been exposed to some European influences. I want, while we're here, to mention just one other thing. Behind the iconostasis there, you can see in the distance, you can see this image of Mary with the veil, the intercession of the Virgin as you'll know, is the story of the protection of the veil. And now I would like to take us back a little bit further. So if you look at the bottom right image here, you can see where we were facing the iconostasis. And if you walk back, you're in the refectory. And here, Nestorov has painted a huge mural. And this also, again, reflects some of his French influences. He was interested in the work of Puvis de Chavannes, Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, a French symbolist painter. You can see here that he has followed somewhat similar type of style, although albeit later, to the very first painting of his that I showed you, the Vision of Saint Bartholomew, with the tranquil Russian landscape scene and the birch trees and a very kind of holy and spiritualized land. However, what he's actually depicting here, if we look closely, is of course the sisters, and we can see them in their white habits, and they are bringing the people to Christ, who is on the right-hand side, receiving them, as you can see. So, for example, we can pick out on the far left, we can see a sister bringing an injured man, perhaps a war veteran. You can see the woman carrying the child. You can see a woman in the middle bringing a child forward. And so you have an active, an illustration perhaps of the mission of the church itself. So as I mentioned, there's a little bit of this idealized, spiritualized Russian landscape that Nestorov was so known for. But he also reflects, or seems to have taken forward some of his other paintings of the time. As I've mentioned, he was always painting these religious kinds of scenes. And this one is Holy Russ from a few years before the convent. And again, you can see Christ among the people. Some features here, if we look at the women in the center, some features here are really blending this realism versus symbolism and trying to sort of mix it together. And those of you who know Russian art from the 19th century will know some of the works of painters like Ilya Repin and Vasily Surikov, for example. And we see some of the parallels here, albeit religious theme. So for my last comment on the interiors, I wanted to just pick out this image of the nun carrying the child and show you a sketch which Nestorov had done, a preparatory sketch for this. And this really shows you as well the fact that there's a kind of blend between the real and then the mythical and symbolic here. So I'd like to end with a few words about the life of the convent after the revolution. It continued for a few years after Yelizaveta's death, but it was then closed by the Soviets in 1926, and it was used for completely different purposes for many, many years. Some people continued to remember Yelizaveta, but it wasn't until 1981 that she was declared a saint. Initially by the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, and then a year after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, she was recognized by the Orthodox Church in Russia. And the convent itself reopened in 1994, and it's still opened now, but there's also a museum. So if you go there, you can be shown around some of the secular parts as well. So Yelizaveta has been commemorated in more recent history. There are statues of her, memorials. One of them was erected in the convent grounds. That's the one that you see on the right. But the one on the left is actually from Westminster Abbey. And this reflects the fact that she was one of the new martyrs of the 20th century. This was unveiled in 1998, and it's a row of figures. Elizaveta is next to Martin Luther King there. And even more recently, in 2018, members of the Russian Orthodox Church gathered at Ella's tomb to mark 100 years since the murder of her and her family in 1918. And it's another example of how in post-Soviet Russia, they've recovered religion and also imperial aspects of imperial history. And this ceremony took place at the Mary Magdalen Monastery in Gethsemane in Jerusalem. If I can return to linking this with Elizaveta's artistic life, it's actually a church that is also was also built around this time in the 19th century. It's another one in the 19th century revival style, and it was a church that was organized. The building of it was organized by Elizaveta and her husband Sergei. And draped over her tomb, as you see on the left, is a pall, another of these religious, a religious cloth. And this is embroidered by Elizaveta. And so to end, I'd like to simply conclude that the resting place of Ella reflects her significance not only in Romanov history, her canonization, but also her participation in art and craft in the last years of the Russian Empire. Thank you.